Lovely. Thanks. Please carry on, Tricia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christina. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge we have another colleague who's on the meeting today. Amy Zawi is here. She's working with me in the Partnership of Christians and Jews. But I wanted to thank you, David and Rachel, for hosting this today. I want to thank Christina for having first introduced me to Brenda. It's been a couple years now. I think this is the fourth time, it's at least the third or the fourth time Brenda's had me speak to one of her two different meetings. Just a couple months ago, I spoke a little bit, and then she wanted me to go into a lot more depth on Ruth today, as we talked about that. And Annette, it's good to see you again. I really enjoyed our conversation after the last time that we were on. So the Partnership of Christians and Jews really officially got started in 2016. We were working on things before that at camera, but we actually came up with the name and had a major conference in LA in 2016 that really launched this. And the focus of the partnership is twofold. One, by the name, you can tell that we want to build Jews and Christians together. Jewish-Christian relations has always been very important to me. It's something that God's put in my heart for decades, and that I've been involved in for decades in a number of very meaningful ways. And then the second purpose of the partnership is to refute any anti-Semitism, any anti-Zionism in the church, in any Christian organizations, anywhere that it appears, and to specifically strengthen the evangelical support for Israel. We unfortunately have lost, in the previous decades, lost a lot of support for Israel in the mainline denominations. So my strategy has been from the beginning to target the evangelical world and strengthen that support and educate them and give them the tools they need to fight the lies and the propaganda about Israel. So that's basically what we do. A lot of education. I have been speaking, you can tell from my voice probably. I've been doing a lot of speaking, I'm traveling, and just trying to educate pastors specifically. I really, really like to meet with pastors because then, that's a multiplying effect. So I'll just put this out there. If you know of any pastors who would like to have me speak in their church, etc., online, whatever, I really, really like to be able to get into the churches and give not just the people, but the pastors the tools to equip their people and to have this multiply so people can stand up against the lies. And what I'm going to do today in studying in a more in-depth study of Ruth, and I had talked about this with Brenda, Ruth is a fantastic example of how we stand with the Jewish people today. She's inspirational. And I know the hearts of all of you on this call, I know that you wouldn't be here, except that you already have this heart to stand with the Jewish people. But I want to give us some encouragement from the scriptures, because times are not getting any easier. It's only going to get worse. And so I just want to be able to strengthen us and encourage us today. So I want to talk about how Ruth demonstrated chesed, that's a Hebrew word, chesed, and great courage in everything she did. Chesed is a Hebrew word that describes character traits of kindness, mercy, faithfulness, and unconditional love. We see all this in Ruth. And we're going to see that the way Ruth related to the Jewish people in her life provides an inspiring example for us as we stand with the Jewish people today. Ruth was a Moabite, a Gentile. She made a personal decision to believe in the God of Israel and join herself to the Jewish people. In Ruth 1, 16 through 17, we know these words. They're often used in weddings. We know these words, but let's think about what it meant to Ruth when Ruth said this. When Naomi tried to discourage Ruth from going to Bethlehem with her, Ruth said, "Do not make me leave you to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. And I just want to share a little personal testimony about how this changed my life. Like I said, I've been involved in Jewish-Christian relations for decades. I was very involved in the Jewish community in Los Angeles. And I had a very good friend who was a Holocaust survivor. And I had started going to services with him. I started going on Purim. That's the first time I ever went to a synagogue, because I was doing I did a PhD in Hebrew Bible, and I was writing my dissertation on Esther. So Purim's the holiday, right, that gets instituted in Esther. So the very first time I went to a synagogue service was for Purim. But then I started going on Shabbat with him. The rabbis got to know me. Long story short, finally, one year they asked me to share in the teaching for Shavuot, the holiday of Shavuot, which is, we know, as Pentecost. And what the Jews study on Shavuot is Ruth, the book of Ruth. And so they asked me to teach on Ruth. And sometimes people assume if you're doing a PhD in Hebrew Bible, you know the whole Hebrew Bible. Not, I was focusing on Esther, and yeah, I did you have to do a survey of everything. But anyway, I hadn't studied Ruth in detail. So that obviously it was totally intimidating to me to go and be asked to teach in a synagogue with rabbis who were also going to be doing the teaching. But I studied it, and it was during that preparation that the Lord showed me, oh, I am a Ruth. I hadn't really thought about this before, but I'm a Gentile woman who has made that decision to join my life to the Jewish people. And that's exactly the commitment that I've made, that where they go, I'll go. Where they lodge, I'll lodge. Their people are my people. And where they die, I'll die. And so when I first began my teaching that night, and that first time that I ever taught on Ruth, I started with that, and I shared this, and that, just what God has done in my heart and how much I love them, and that I was standing with them. And you could have heard a pin drop in that room. And they're not normally, if you've been to synagogue services, they're not quiet. They talk to each other. They'll even interrupt the rabbi when he's teaching and say, well, what about this? Or, ask a question. They were just silent. And, I could just feel how much it meant to them. So that's why I wanted to share this now, because the Jewish people need this more than ever. They need to know that we're with them, that we stand with them no matter what. And because of the commitment that Ruth made to God, the God, and the people of Israel, she became the great-grandmother of the future King David and the ancestor of our Jewish Messiah, Yeshua, who's the son of David. So what I want to talk about is how Ruth, the Gentile, demonstrated great chesed and courage in her relationships with Naomi, her Jewish mother-in-law, and Boaz, the Jewish man she would marry. So she's a great example for us, assuming all of us on this call are Gentiles. She's a great example to us of how to stand with the Jewish people. Well, Ruth is also a book that is in dialogue with some other issues in other scriptures. And I want to talk about those. This is not a bunny trail, might sound like that, but it's not. There's two issues I want to talk about that Ruth's story addresses, that other scriptures talk about, because she would have been aware of these issues because she had married into a Jewish family. And knowing that she would have been aware of these issues makes our understanding of the chesed and the courage that she demonstrated even greater. So one issue that's in scripture that we see in sometimes contradictory terms, because some scriptures will say one thing and some will say another. There's the tension between the welcome that's to be given to foreigners versus the fact that Moabites are to be excluded from the community of Israel. And remember, Ruth's a Moabite. She knew the history between her people and the Jewish people. And the second issue is that of intermarriage with someone outside the community of Israel versus the dangers of intermarriage. All right, so Ruth was a foreigner who made this commitment to go to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law. She ended up being welcomed into that Jewish community. That's in line with some of the scriptures about welcoming the foreigner, but she could have easily been excluded because of her Moabite ethnicity. And on top of that, she married a Jew, which according to some scriptures is forbidden. But it's obvious her marriage was blessed by God because she became the great-grandmother of David, the ancestor of Yeshua. You can be sure that Ruth knew what the Israelites thought of her people, the Moabites. There was a long history of animosity between these two peoples. And you can also be sure that she would have known there was probably no chance of her ever being able to remarry if she went to Bethlehem. And yet she made the decision to remain loyal to Naomi anyway and leave her family and homeland. Well, scripture has a lot to say about the welcome that's to be given to foreigners. Deuteronomy, though, says Moabites were to be excluded. Ruth is identified right away in the 4th verse of the book as a Moabite. So I want to read Ruth 1 through 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Kilion. They were Ephrathites from Beit Lechem, Bethlehem, Beit Lechem, which that means the house of bread. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Kilion also died, so the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. All right, so that's the setting. Now we know that's how Ruth came to be in relationship with Naomi. And now I want to continue reading in chapter 1, verses 6 through 18. Then she, meaning Naomi, she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she'd been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your father's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each in the house of your husband." So she's wanting them to, she realizes the only security for a woman in those days was to be married. Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. And even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. You can see Naomi's giving them very common sense advice. Obviously she's not going to have any sons, probably ever, and they're never going to be old enough for these 2 young women to be able to remarry. So she's giving very practical advice. And then in verse 15, she says, look, Naomi's still speaking, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." And then these are the pivotal verses in the whole story. I'm going to read them again, verses 16 through 18. Ruth said, "Do not make me leave you to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Okay, Ruth's identity as a Moabite is extremely significant in this story, as evidenced by the fact that the text refers to Ruth as a Moabite 6 times, 4 times by the narrator, and then twice by Boaz, as late as chapter 4, near the end of the story. We know repetition in the biblical text is done for emphasis. So therefore, it's important for the author of this book to make the point that Ruth was a foreigner from the land of Moab. Very briefly, for the sake of context, Moab was a territory east of the Dead Sea in the southern part of what is now Jordan. And Genesis 19 traces the origin of the Moabites to the incest between Lot and his daughter after they escaped from Sodom. Generations later, the descendants of Lot caused trouble for the Israelites as they traveled from Egypt to the Promised Land. In Numbers 22 and 23, we find that story of where the king of Moab wanted to have the Israelites destroyed while they're traveling through the wilderness, and he hired the prophet Balaam from Mesopotamia to curse them, which Balaam ended up, he couldn't curse them, but the point is the king of Moab is the one who wanted the Israelites destroyed. And then in Numbers 25, the Moabites invited the Israelites to participate in sacrifices to their gods, just as they're about to enter the land. The Israelites have finally made it through all their time in the wilderness. They're about to enter the land, and then right at the end, you have these people, the Moabites, wanting them to sacrifice to their gods. So because of all this, this is why the scriptures say the Moabites shouldn't be allowed into the community of Israel. Ruth's decision to join herself to Naomi and her people and to make the God of Israel her God meant she was leaving behind her hometown, her people, and her deities. Naomi referred to the deities of Moab. She's leaving behind all of this. And it meant that she was choosing to go with Naomi to a place she had never seen, to live with a people she had never met, and to serve a different God. So not only does her decision demonstrate great chesed, remember those are all the qualities of kindness, mercy, faithfulness, and unconditional love, but it also demonstrates great courage, because she would have had a lot of reason to wonder what kind of reception she's going to get in Bethlehem as a Moabite. And at one point I thought, I kind of compared what she did, her decision to go, I kind of compared that with Abram being called out of Mesopotamia to go, God said, go to a land that I'll show you. Abram had no idea where he was going. Ruth had no idea really what she was getting into, but I actually think that Ruth's decision demonstrates even greater courage, trust in the God who they've decided to follow, because Abram had his family and he had his flocks, he had provisions, he was a man, and he had provision, and Ruth had nothing. And to be an unmarried woman in that culture it really meant you had nothing. So I've reflected on that. The more I think about it, the more I am really amazed by her courage. So it's interesting to note, I mentioned that in the text, she's identified as a Moabite 6 times. In spite that she's still identified as a Moabite, in spite of the fact she's made that decision to join herself to the people and the God of Israel. So the fact that she's a Moabite and the fact that she becomes part of the community reflects the welcome that's to be given to foreigners who want to join themselves to the people of God. Leviticus 19:34 says, "You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." The use of the word sojourns in this description of the stranger means foreigners who come to live with the people, to join their lives with the Israelites. Those are the ones who are to be loved as they love themselves, not just people who want to come through and, you know, just make use of your land or whatever, but it's people who have made the decision to join themselves to the Israelites. Isaiah 56, 6-7 addresses this subject. It says, the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So in other words, the foreigners who are to be accepted into the people of Israel are those who come to join themselves to them in the way Isaiah describes. So the difference between acceptance and exclusion is determined by whether that person is going to join themselves to the people and not lead them into idolatry like the Moabites tried to do when the Israelites were still in the wilderness. Well, the story of Ruth also speaks to a tension that we see in scripture between intermarriage or not. There are examples of intermarriage in the scripture. And in order to better appreciate Ruth's demonstration of chesed and courage in making that decision to go with Naomi, I want to think about what the biblical prohibitions against intermarriage, especially a Moabite. Ruth had 2 strikes against her. Okay, she's not just a Gentile, but she's a Moabite. And what these would have meant to Ruth. What I'm wanting us to see is the situation from her perspective, so we can better appreciate how difficult it must have been for her to make the decision that she made to go. She would have known that her chances for remarriage were not promising, to say the least. All right, her intermarriage is probably the most thoroughly discussed of any in the scriptures, and it's probably because it's not just any marriage, but she's part of the lineage of King David. And the importance of the relationship between Ruth as David's great-grandmother is demonstrated by the fact the story ends with not 1, but 2 accounts of the genealogy of Jesus. There's 2 of David, I mean. There's 2 genealogies there, and the genealogies both end with David, and David's the last word in the book of Ruth. So obviously the author's emphasizing the importance of Ruth's connection to David, Israel's most famous king, obviously, and the ancestor of Yeshua. And so this Moabite woman is included in this very essential genealogy, and the whole book that tells this story is named after her. So that's pretty amazing, too. There are other intermarriages described in the biblical text with no apparent objection. With the biblical writers don't seem to object to the marriage of Joseph. He married the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Moses married the daughter of a Midianite priest. And of course, Esther married a Persian king. Well, from his marriage to the daughter of an Egyptian priest, Joseph had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They were blessed by their grandfather Jacob, and their descendants received portions of the land along with the other tribes. So they're certainly included. Moses was called by God to deliver the people of Egypt after he was married to Zipporah, the Midianite. Esther was married to the Persian king and was in a position to make it legal for the Jews of Persia to defend themselves against annihilation. So these are very important, obviously strategic marriages. But in contrast to these examples, there is explicit opposition to intermarriage. Isaac and Rebekah really objected to Esau's marriages to all the Canaanite women. Numbers 25 and 31 talk about the dangers of relations with specifically Moabite and Midianite women. That's amazing that those texts point that out, because Ruth was a Moabite, and then Moses' wife was a Midianite. The book of Kings talks very negatively about Solomon and all of his foreign wives. And Deuteronomy 7 talks about it. Ezra, Nehemiah, it's very clear they vehemently opposed intermarriage between the Judeans and the people of the land. So but just like the first issue I talked about, the opposition to intermarriage, it's always stated in the context of the threat that it represents to the survival of the people and the faith of Israel. It's always accompanied by warnings that the Gentile spouse will lead the Israelite spouse from the worship of the God of Israel. So that's the bottom line. That's the difference. So that's how these two issues get resolved in the story of Ruth. But I wanted to go over them because you have to, if you put yourself, humanize the characters in the story, humanize the story, think about what Ruth would have known in her context and the issues she would have known she was facing by going to Bethlehem. It's just phenomenal that she made the decision that she made. So obviously her marriage to Boaz is not only accepted, it's celebrated, because before she ever got to Bethlehem, before she ever met Boaz, she had already made that decision. She had already declared Naomi's people would be her people and Naomi's God, her God. So now I think we can have a much greater appreciation for her particular acts of chesed. So now I want to talk about a few of those. When she attached herself to Naomi, and that's really what she did. It was really very graphic in the Hebrew, what the decision she was making in chapter 1, when she insisted on going with her to Bethlehem. She didn't know how her story would end. She had no idea what kind of reception she was going to get in Bethlehem. It's pretty obvious she would have had a much better chance of getting married in Moab. Naomi told her that, go back to the house of your mother, so you can find security in the house of a husband. So it's clear from the text that Ruth did not have to do the things she did. She was not obligated to leave her country and go with Naomi. And Naomi tried to persuade her not once, but 3 times. Well, the reasons that Naomi gave Ruth for not coming with her sounded reasonable. I commented on that. They sounded like they came from concern for Ruth's future, and I'm sure they did, because Naomi also would have been aware of the potential for rejection once they reached Bethlehem. But after that initial conversation on the road, the rest of the story shows some lack of practical care for Ruth on Naomi's part. And so I want to talk about them, a couple of these examples, not to demean Naomi. Naomi was suffering. She was hurting. She had lost her husband and then both of her sons. But I just want to point them out, what happened, because once again, I'm trying to bring attention to Ruth's demonstration of chesed and courage in doing what she did. It's possible that Naomi, one of the thoughts Naomi might have been having in discouraging Ruth from coming with her, is that she may have been reluctant to arrive in Bethlehem with a Moabite daughter-in-law. She knew that Moabites weren't welcome. And part of the reason I think this is possible is because of what happens in chapter 1, verses 20 to 21. When Naomi first arrived back in Bethlehem, she said to the women who greeted her, this is verse 20, she says, "Don't call me no longer Naomi." Naomi means pleasant. Naomi says, "Call me Mara." Mara means bitter. And Naomi says, "For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." So when they arrive in town, the women greet her, and and they call her Naomi. "Oh, Naomi's back." They're excited to see her. And she says, "No, don't call me Naomi." And she says, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Well, think now again, I'm trying to, keep us focused on how Ruth is feeling, what she's experiencing. How would this have made her feel? She's given up everything to join herself to Naomi and the people of Israel. When they arrived in Bethlehem, Naomi didn't introduce her. It doesn't say in the text, Naomi didn't introduce her. She didn't even acknowledge her presence. Instead, what she says to the women is, the Lord's brought me back empty. So maybe Naomi was worried about what people in her hometown would think. Maybe she began to wonder if having Ruth with her would affect people's desire to help her. Who knows? Because she was coming back destitute and she needed help. And the Israelites really didn't think very well of Moabites. So if any of this was true, Ruth would have been able to sense that. And so that this scene makes the hesed that Ruth continued to demonstrate even more profound. Going back to when the two women were still on the road for a minute, this gives us more insight. It says in chapter 1, 18 through 22, that when Naomi saw how determined Ruth was to stay with her, she stopped talking with her all the way to Bethlehem. Well, the word that's translated determined is unusual in the form in which it appears in the Hebrew. It's from the root word, which means to be strong or bold. But in this particular case, it's in a reflexive form, meaning reflexive is something that you do to yourself, an action you do to yourself. And so the form it's in the Hebrew means that Ruth was making herself strong. And the same root word is used in Deuteronomy 31 and Joshua when Moses and the Lord exhort Joshua to be strong and determined when he's about to lead the people into the land. So the use of this word in the reflexive makes it clear that Ruth was making herself strong in order to be determined to go with Naomi. And so I think this gives a lot of insight into the courage she was demonstrating at this point. Maybe she was even fearful of going in light of what she knew about the history between Israel and Moab, and in light of what she knew her chances for getting married would be. But she made herself strong and went with Naomi anyway. Well, then, after this demonstration of courage on Ruth's part, Naomi stopped talking to her all the way to Bethlehem. We don't know how long this silence lasted. We don't know how long it would have taken to walk from Moab to Bethlehem. We do know the road between the nearest spot in Moab and Bethlehem was at least 50 miles. I don't know what that translates into kilometers. I'm sorry for you all, but 50 miles. And we don't know where they were on this road when Ruth expressed her determination to keep going. We don't know how fast they were walking, especially Naomi was somewhat elderly. But so who knows how long the silence lasted, but even if it was one day, I would think it would have been rather uncomfortable for Ruth. If you're traveling along a road with somebody and they don't talk to you, you'd be wondering, what are they thinking? And we don't know the reason for the silence. We don't know. The point is that we don't really know what Naomi is thinking or feeling about Ruth, except for the fact that when they arrive, and the text emphasizes the two of them were together when they arrived in Bethlehem, and the women greet Naomi, and nobody acknowledges Ruth. They just don't even acknowledge that she's standing there. So, we just really don't know how Ruth was feeling, but obviously it couldn't have been comfortable. So verse 19 of chapter 1 gives us some insight into this, into Naomi's arrival, when it says the whole city buzzed with excitement or confusion. That's usually how it's translated, with those two words, either excitement or confusion. And in the Hebrew, it's feminine plural verbs that are used here when it says the whole city, but it's feminine plural. It specifically means it's the women of the city who are reacting to her arrival. The women are greeting her. And the word that is used in this verse to describe how they reacted, it's usually translated as excitement. But when this word is used elsewhere in the Bible, it connotes more of a sense of confusion. And so it's not difficult to imagine, right? That it might have been confusing for the women of Bethlehem to have Naomi be standing there with a daughter-in-law who's a Moabite. So they I would think there was some confusion. So Ruth's decision to go to Judah with Naomi that's just her first act of courage and chesed. There's more. After this initial interaction, she initiates her next course of action, which is to work for food for the two of them. In so doing, she continues to demonstrate her faithfulness, her commitment to Naomi in a very practical way. She was willing to go to work for her mother-in-law. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of corn behind someone in whose sight I may find favor.' She said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech." Just as it happened is what the text says. Obviously, we know the Lord was leading her, the Lord was taking care of her, but the way it's worded in the text is as it happened. So now I'm going to read from chapter 2, verses 17 through 23. So Ruth, gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left after she herself had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, saying, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, that's one more time where she's identified as the Moabite. Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my young men until I have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, otherwise someone might bother you in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. In chapter 2, verse 1, the reader already learned that Naomi had this close kinsman named Boaz. And then we see that when Ruth said she's going to go find a field to glean in, Naomi did not tell her, she didn't give her any advice. She didn't tell her, "Oh, go find the field belonging to Boaz." Because remember in verse 3, it says, "As it happened, Ruth came to the field belonging to Boaz." So I have to wonder, why wouldn't Naomi have told Ruth about Boaz before she went out to glean her first day? Why wouldn't she have advised her on where to glean when she was going out in unknown circumstances in a new country on her own as a single woman? She was very vulnerable. Going to work in the fields of strangers was a dramatic act of courage on Ruth's part. It was not safe for a single woman to go to an unknown field to reap. And the fact that Ruth went out without any advice from Naomi, it just shows a lack of care, at least for Ruth on the part of Naomi, but great courage on the part of Ruth. Not only did Naomi not tell her about who Boaz was, but she didn't warn her about, take care of yourself, be safe, whatever. She didn't express any concern for her safety. It was only after Ruth returned that Naomi agreed. Like she says, "Yeah, you should follow the instructions of Boaz, that you should only work in with the women in the fields of Boaz." The fact that Ruth was facing danger in doing this, it's demonstrated by two words that Boaz and Naomi both used in their instructions to Ruth. In verse 9 of chapter 2, Boaz told Ruth that he commanded the men not to reach out or touch her. And the word used here, it's nagah, has a range of meanings, which includes an inappropriate or a sexual touch. So Boaz recognized that she could be a danger, and he told the men who worked for him not to touch her. In verse 22, Naomi agreed with those instructions and told Ruth, oh yeah, it's good for you to reap with the women who work for Boaz so that she would not be harassed. And the word that Naomi used there that's translated harassed is pagah, and it means to encounter with the sense of meeting with hostility. So they're both of them were acknowledging that this was dangerous for Ruth. And when these words are used in other settings, in the biblical text, it does connote the use of violence. But in spite of this, what I'm trying to, emphasize, in spite of this, in spite of however Ruth is treated, she went out with courage. She was treating her mother-in-law with, she was acting in faithfulness and unconditional love. And then the drama's not over there. In chapter 2, chapter 3 begins with Naomi telling Ruth, I got a plan for how I'm going to seek security for you. And what she means is she knows she needs to help Ruth find a husband, because that was the definition of security in that culture. And so in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, Naomi gives Ruth all these instructions about wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, go to the threshing floor where Boaz is going to be threshing the wheat from the day. And she has to go in the middle of the night because that's when Boaz is going to be finished working. And she says, and wait till he's eaten and wait till he's finished eating and drinking, and then see where he goes and lies down, and then go lie down next to him. And then so Ruth did that. It's not clear exactly what Naomi was telling Ruth to do, because some of the words used in these verses do have double entendres in the Hebrew. There's sexual overtones in the Hebrew. What is clear from this scene is that for the third time in this story, Ruth is demonstrating great chesed and courage by doing what Naomi tells her to do. She says, I'll do it. She's willing to go out at night to another setting that certainly isn't going to be safe physically, just by the fact she has to go out on the road at night by herself. Certainly is not going to be safe for her reputation if she was seen going there. But as the scene in chapter 3 continues to unfold, it's very clear Ruth did not do things exactly like Naomi instructed. The sexual overtones are replaced. They're not there anymore. Boaz is asleep. Then when he wakes up and he discovers Ruth's presence, he's startled. And Naomi had said to Ruth, Boaz will tell you what to do next. But Boaz, before Boaz can even talk, Ruth takes the initiative, and she begins to tell Boaz what he needs to do. She reminds him that because of his relationship to Naomi, he is a goel, a redeeming kinsman. That's someone who has the responsibility to protect vulnerable relatives and, if possible, redeem the family's land that they had lost by leaving to go to Moab, and then Naomi being widowed, because only, again, in this culture, only a man could own the land. So knowing this, Ruth asked Boaz to spread his robe or his wing over her. And in doing that, Ruth is asking for his support and actually proposing marriage. The position of someone who's identified as a redeeming kinsman was of great significance in this time period. The redeeming kinsman, the goel, was a person's closest relative, and they had the biblical responsibility to rescue a person in need, such as Ruth and Naomi. So Ruth was actually asking Boaz to marry her, to not only provide for her physical needs, but to provide a child who would perpetuate the name of this family. Well, Boaz was so impressed with her chesed that he called her an Eshet Chayil. That's a woman of valor. That's what Proverbs 31 is all about, the woman of valor. And he agreed to do everything she asked. And, we know the end of the story. They got married. So we see from chapter 1 to chapter 4, Ruth's personal life was redeemed and transformed in the beginning of the book, she's a widow, she's a Moabite, she's outside the community of Israel, but because of her commitment to Naomi's people and Naomi's God, she's accepted into the community. She becomes the wife of Boaz, the great-grandmother of David, the ancestor of Yeshua, all because she made Naomi's people her people and Naomi's God her God. I want to, using her as an example now, I want to remind us that our faith needs to be demonstrated through our actions. So many times we say never again, or yeah, we stand with Israel, yes, but what are we actually doing about it? Our faith needs to be demonstrated through our actions. How we stand with the Jewish people, our words, our acknowledgement, our understanding of this hatred of Jews and how bad that is, how wrong it is, it has to be backed up with action. That it's always required some courage and chesed, but now we're living in an ever increasing dangerous time for all of us, most particularly for the Jewish people. They're always first. They're always the first ones in danger, but then it never, whatever happens to the Jewish people never stops with the Jewish people. We are living in dangerous times like none of us have seen before in our lifetime, unless we are over 90 and we were alive in the 1930s in Germany. We've never seen times like this before, and we must be prepared to act. It's imperative in light of these times in which we live that we know what we are prepared to do when confronted with persecution of the Jewish people. The vast majority of the people who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, people like Corrie ten Boom and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they did what they did because of deeply held biblical beliefs that were formed through a lifetime of study of the scriptures. They didn't do what they did on a moment's notice. If you're suddenly confronted with terror, it's hard to make the right decision, to do what's right if you're being threatened yourself. They certainly didn't do what they did because it was the popular thing to do or make them look good. Unfortunately, I've had encounters with people who just want to do something for Israel because it makes them, they think it makes them look good. I know I'm talking to a bunch of people whose heart is genuinely for standing with Israel, and I'm just trying to encourage us all. I'm encouraging myself. I'm speaking to myself at this time because it's going to get more dangerous. The people like Corrie ten Boom and Dietrich Bonhoeffer did what they did because they had a deep understanding of what the Bible reveals about God's love and plans for the Jewish people. That's what's going to give us the conviction and the strength to do whatever is necessary to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. We have a clear explanation of the relationship between faith and action in James. In chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, James gives a detailed exhortation on this. And in verse 20, James writes, "Do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead?" And in verse 26, he says, "For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead." And as we've seen from Ruth, she didn't just profess her faith in the God of Israel and her commitment to the people of Israel. She walked out that statement by persevering on a difficult journey with Naomi to go to a place where she had a very uncertain future. She persevered in spite of the fact that Naomi didn't appear to be supportive of her decision. She tried to discourage it. She didn't, as far as we can tell, she didn't express appreciation for anything Ruth did. And she didn't offer her guidance after they first arrived in Bethlehem. So this is what Ruth says to me. In spite of the circumstances, in spite of the danger, and there will be danger, in spite of people's unsupportive attitudes and apparent lack of appreciation, if a Jewish person never says thank you, if they don't seem to understand why we want to stand with them, doesn't matter. In spite of all of that, we are called to walk in courage and chesed in everything we do. And Ruth's example speaks to me as a Gentile about how committed we are to be to walk with the Jewish people. In spite of the difficulties, in spite of whatever may come, in spite of the cost, Ruth gave up everything. And in spite, especially in spite of what the Jewish people do or do not do. And this is a really important point because throughout Christian history, various accusations against the Jewish people concerning things they have done or not done have been used to justify the erroneous belief that God has no further purpose for the Jews. And taken to its logical outcome, this leads to the belief that Jews don't have a right to exist. And it also helps Christians justify their abandonment of the Jewish people by Christians. Christians all throughout Nazi Germany and Europe did this. They figured, well, it doesn't matter. God's finished with the Jews. They deserve whatever's happening to them. So this is really important that we understand that our commitment to the Jewish people and to Israel is in spite of whatever they do or don't do. And I want to point out that this serious error, this serious erroneous belief is refuted by the fact that God made a Berit Olam, an eternal covenant with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, beginning in Genesis 12. And in Genesis 15, where we have the scene of the covenant making, God cut the eternal covenant with Abram in a way that demonstrated he alone is responsible for fulfilling it. In Genesis 15:17, we have the scene of a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch. Those are symbols of God. Those symbols of God passed between the pieces of sacrificial animals that were cut up for the covenant making ceremony. However, Abram didn't take part in this covenant making. He was asleep. So as the sole participant in the covenant making ceremony, God demonstrated that he alone is responsible for fulfilling that covenant. This eternal covenant that God made, and eternal is eternal. I don't know that there's no end to eternal. This eternal covenant is not dependent on anything Abram or his descendants do or don't do, because he wasn't even part of the covenant making. It's all dependent on God. And as we know, God keeps his covenants. God does not lie. He keeps his covenants. So likewise, our love and support for the Jewish people must be unconditional, not dependent on anything they do or don't do, not based on any expectations we have from them. And that love and support must be demonstrated through action that will require chesed and great courage in the days to come. And this is how we need to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. So if we still have time, I'm happy to take questions. David, if you want to do that. I don't know if we still have time, whatever you want to do next.
Yes, we do. We could have if anybody wants to thank you so much, Trisha. That was